Then get started. All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the first of our two webinars about the Boston Region MPO's No Heat project. My name is Seth Stromwasser. I'm a data analyst at the Boston Region MPO, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Ronak Basu from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Um, and we'll just jump right into it. Ronak, would you like to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ronak Basu. I'm an assistant professor in the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Tech, and I used to work at the Boston Region MPO before my current position.
Great, thank you. All right, so here's an overview of today's presentation. I'm going to get started by introducing the Boston Region MPO and our project. And then I'll talk about extreme heat and transportation and walk through the development of a new data set to measure extreme heat on our street network. I'll then pass it off to Dr. Basu to talk about how we use this data to understand heat risk across the region and other use cases for our data. So the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, for those that don't know, is a regional public agency covering the 97 cities and towns in and around Boston. We not only study transportation issues, but we also provide millions of dollars in federal transportation funds for local projects. And in the summer of 2024, we launched a project called Neutralizing Onerous Heat Effects on Active Transportation, also known as No Heat. And there are four main elements to this project. So last summer, we completed development of high-resolution microclimate data that we're going to talk about today and conducted a risk analysis on heat stress for people walking and biking. That process gave us a list of high-risk locations to focus on, which we then brought to our municipal and community partners for feedback. And through walk and bike audits and other engagement events, we worked with the community to decide where to install low-cost, quick-build heat mitigation infrastructure, and use these as pilot interventions across the region. And we're continuing to conduct public engagement to gather feedback on these pilots and hear about people's experience with heat when they're moving around outside. And like I just mentioned, cross-sector collaboration is a key element of this project. We partnered with researchers at Georgia Tech, the municipalities of Chelsea, Everett, Revere, and Framingham, and community-based organizations Walk Massachusetts, Mass Bike, Bike to the Sea, and the Mystic River Watershed Association. We received a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant from the state's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs to complete this work. And so we'll just start with a quick interactive activity. So if folks could just take a look at these two pictures and feel free to put in the chat or unmute yourself and just say, what do you notice about these two pictures? What's different between them? I'm seeing trees, more shade on the left. Yeah, dedicated bike lane. Anything else folks notice? More shop fronts visible, yeah. Yeah, smaller road. One-way road. Yeah, no shade, no dedicated lane for bikes. Yeah, yeah, these are all great ideas. Bike signage, yeah. Great. So yeah, this is sort of getting us to this idea of perceived distance and talking about the differences between those two images. And so this is the idea where two trips of the same length can feel like they are longer or shorter than they actually are. So for example, you can see in this graphic, these sidewalks are the same length, but the one on top is nice and wide. It's got benches to rest on, trees for shade, like we talked about, stores, like we mentioned. This one on the bottom, on the other hand, the sidewalk's in bad shape. There's lots of cars going by, and it's narrow. So this distance might actually feel longer to somebody who's walking. And if we apply this concept to the transportation system, we can see how environmental factors like heat can actually limit people's access to destination because of longer perceived distances. So another aspect of this issue is that there are known disparities in heat exposure for lower income neighborhoods compared to higher income ones. Heat mitigating infrastructure, access to a vehicle, air conditioning, other amenities are less common in lower income communities. And so that means that people are more vulnerable to heat. And as we saw in the previous slide, people in these communities are therefore more likely to have their access to important destinations limited on hot days. And so we've established that heat has a big impact on people's ability to get around. And this leads us to ask where and how we can intervene to mitigate these impacts. And to answer these questions, we need high quality data. So a common data source for heat stress is land surface temperature, which is shown on the top two maps here. This covers the entire region, and it can provide good insights about disparities in heat exposure between neighborhoods. But it's at a 30-meter resolution, and it has a temporal resolution of more than 2 weeks. So this means that there's only one value for a 30 by 30 meter area, and we only get new data once every 2 weeks. On the bottom, you can see an example of the data that we've produced in no heat. This is 1 meter resolution, which means you can compare at a finer scale, even two sides of the same street. And if you remember what we talked about earlier, those two images were quite close to each other along the same street. With 30-meter resolution data, those two locations might show up as the same temperature, which we know is probably not the case. And so you can see here where I've highlighted Commonwealth Avenue. There's far more detail available on the 1 meter resolution data. Um, and moreover, our data can also be produced on an hourly basis. And so this lets us focus on the hottest part of the day and how heat stress changes throughout the day. So not only are these data higher resolution, but the metric that we're calculating is a new and different way to measure how people experience heat. So to quantify how heat is experienced by people walking, biking, and rolling throughout the region, we turn to the Universal Thermal Climate Index, or UTCI. UTCI is a model that takes into account the way that the human body experiences heat. So data on air temperature, humidity, wind speed, and radiant temperature are merged with assumptions about how a person's metabolism and clothing affect how they process heat. And this produces a perceived temperature that is the UTCI. And you can see here on the right that UTCI can be translated into categories of heat stress that show where heat becomes harmful to human health. So according to this model, temperatures as low as 78 degrees Fahrenheit can be a threat to human health, especially for vulnerable groups like young children or older adults. And just a quick note about when we should be using this model. UTCI is most appropriate for human-centric applications. So for this project, looking at people who are outside, walking and biking, things like heat risk and heat exposure for people. It's not appropriate for looking at the impact of heat on infrastructure or wildlife or other applications that don't involve humans. And we should also note that the data is not available for buildings or water bodies. Metrics like land surface temperature are more suited for comparing different land cover categories. And so here's just a quick overview of the input data that's used to produce the UTCI and the sources that we used. We'll be going into a lot more detail about this in our second webinar, which we'll give information about on at the end. In that webinar, we'll be talking about the tools that we've developed for people to produce this data in their own region. But just quickly, there's sort of five main inputs. A LiDAR point cloud that is used to generate a digital surface model, also a digital elevation model, which also comes from the LiDAR data, meteorological data, which we got from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, one of the major weather models used for forecasting, and then building footprints from Overture Maps, and finally land cover from NOAA. And so that all comes together to produce our data set, which, as I mentioned, has a spatial resolution of 1 meter and an hourly temporal resolution. We selected 3 peak periods to look at. from the perspective of transportation. We looked at morning, which is 9 a.m., afternoon, 1 p.m., and evening at 5 p.m. And we generated data for these peaks on both the hottest day in 2023 and a typical summer day. And so that's 6 total time points for which we generated the data. So as I said earlier, our goal in this project was to be able to identify the highest risk locations for people walking and biking. And in order to identify the hottest corridors, we needed UTCI at the link level. So here's a look at how we got to that link level data for the entire region. UTCI is first produced as a raster data set on the left here. And so this is basically a grid with a value in degrees for every 1 square meter cell. This example here shows the UTCI at 1 p.m. On a typical summer day centered on downtown Boston. And so we overlaid this data with the road network, which we got from OpenStreetMaps, and calculated the mean UTCI along each road segment. This gives us a data set that allows us to highlight the hottest corridors in the region or within particular municipalities. And as you can see, just as an example, there's heat stress on most of the network, even on a typical summer day. But you can see where there are tall buildings or lots of trees, the heat stress is noticeably lower. So I mentioned that the high resolution of this data allows us to make comparisons at a very fine scale. And so here's a quick example of what that could look like. These are 3 streets in Back Bay that are very close together, Marlborough Street, Commonwealth Avenue, and Boylston Street. Looking at the streets, you can see that Commonwealth Avenue is very green. It's got lots of trees and grass. On the other hand, Boylston Street has little shade, a lot of hot pavement, and then Marlborough Street on the left here is somewhere in between the two with partial shade. And so when we add the UTCI onto the map, we can see those conditions reflected in the data. Commonwealth Avenue feels much more comfortable than the other two, especially on the walking path there underneath the trees. And Marlborough Street is still better than Boylston, which is quite hot. And you can even see the difference, like I mentioned, on Commonwealth Avenue between the intersections where there is a lot of sun, and once you get on the path underneath those trees. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Basu to talk about how we've used this data to address extreme heat for people walking and biking and some other use cases for our data set.
Thank you, Seth. I'll walk us through a couple of use cases, no pun intended there. Next slide, please. So the first use case that we've been using the UTCI data for relates to how we can analyze heat risk, especially for people who are outdoors and being exposed directly to the elements. From a transportation perspective, that would be people who are walking or biking, and these include also trips to and from transit. So thinking about that first last mile connection to transit as well. So as Seth mentioned, we have these link level estimates of UTCI at different times of the day, and that represents perceived thermal comfort. And we also used link level estimates of the number of people who were walking on that link or biking on that link at the same time of day, and we can get this at an hourly resolution. These data come from one of our data partners, Replica, which processes a ton of cell phone data to provide these estimates. Next slide, please. So when we have these two layers, we can overlay them and we can conceptualize heat risk as not just where is it hot, which a lot of other studies have looked at, but we want to also think about exposure, right? Who is outside, who is experiencing that extreme heat? So we can then identify these high risk locations that are a combination of where it is hottest and where we have a lot of people outside walking or biking. And we can do this at the regional level, which we have done for the entire Boston MPO region, as well as at the local level. We've looked at a few different municipalities in our region. We do have the data to be able to do this for all 97 cities and towns in the Boston metro area. Next slide, please. So here, just to give us a bit of a refresher, so we have link level UTCI at different times of the day. Here you can see the morning peak, which is 9 a.m., and the afternoon peak, which is 1 p.m. We are calling these peaks because these represent peaks of travel activity. So we typically see three peaks during the course of the day: morning, afternoon, and evening, when most trips are being taken. So we focused on those three times of the day. And then we also pulled in pedestrian and bike activity for those times. Next slide, please. So when we combine them, we get maps and data sets that look something like this. So here's an example for Boston. We see the UTCI data in the map that's highlighted, and then we can look at trip count data, again at the link level, separately for walking and biking. And then when we combine the trip count data with the UTCI data, we get heat risk, right? So we can identify those highest risk locations. And in these maps, we're showing the links and corridors that represent the top 10th percentile of that combination of UTCI and trip count. So we can zoom into those particular corridors and really hone in on which locations are the highest heat risk within one particular community, as we'll see on the next slide. So we are working with four municipal partners for this round of the project. We are working with Chelsea, Everett, Revere, and Framingham. And here's an example from Chelsea, Everett, and Revere. We looked at them together as one study area because they are in close proximity to each other. And we can see these highlighted corridors that show up as highest risk. And one thing I'd like to call your attention to is that these high risk corridors stand out separately depending on the mode of transportation, right? So, for example, we see Everett Avenue showing up as a high risk corridor for those who are walking. But then the part of Everett Avenue that extends up into the north, that did not show up for walking, but that does show up for biking. Similarly, we see Broadway showing up differently as well when we consider the mode of transportation. And we've done this for Framingham as well, and we do have the data to do this for all 97 cities and towns. Next slide, please. So that was about heat risk analysis. So once we've identified these high risk corridors, we can then go out into the ground as we have done with our municipal and CBO partners and try to install heat mitigation interventions as pilots. We have four pilot locations currently that you're welcome to check out and give us feedback on. The other use case that we've looked at is how we can use the UTCI data to look at access to critical destinations such as transit. So this builds on that idea of perceived distance, where we don't want to necessarily think of how many destinations can people access within a 500-meter walk or bike ride. It's more about what feels like 500 meters, right? So if it feels hotter or more unpleasant, people may be willing to walk for less than whatever threshold we might want to assume as an average value for the entire population. So this graphic is from a study that we had published a couple of years ago looking at pedestrian trips to all destinations, but here we calculated access to transit. And you can see that as we build in the UTCI into the measure of perceived distance, accessibility to transit decreases. So it drops to roughly 30% compared to 100% without including any measure of perceived distance. And that's on a typical summer day. On the hottest summer day, it reduces even further. So this shows that there is value in incorporating different measures of perceived distance, and particularly the UTCI, which helps us get a better measure of access to critical destinations, including but not limited to transit. Next slide, please. So how do we share this data and help communities use this data directly? So we can think of providing navigation recommendations to users with the UTCI data built into the networks. So instead of Google or Apple Maps, which provides recommendations on the shortest routes, we can think of providing recommendations for the coolest or the greenest routes to critical destinations, right? So if people had that information at hand, they might end up making different decisions. They might end up taking a little bit of a detour, as we see in the graphic over here. So even though that route is longer, it is greener and it is cooler. And as a result, more people might end up using that. So next slide, please. So we've built this prototype for us to look at, again, the four municipal partners who we're working with, Chelsea, Revere, Everett, and Framingham. And we've built this to help inform some of the work that we're doing with the pilots, also thinking about putting up wayfinding signs for people to access those shelters. So you can put in your origin and destination, select your mode of transportation, walking or biking, and you can choose whatever combination of factors that would make the most sense to you based on your preferences, right? So you could have a combination of distance and heat, and the heat data are represented by the UTCI. So here you see that we this tool gives us the shortest route, which we see in purple, and up to three alternative routes, which are slightly longer, but then they are cooler and greener. So with this information in hand, we can start thinking about how people might make trade-offs and how communities might be able to access cooler and greener routes with just a short increase in the walking or biking time. Next slide, please. So those were the two use cases. We are happy to take questions about them and the data set afterwards as well. I'll pass it back to Seth so he can share more about the resources that we have available for you to explore.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're just going to wrap up here sharing some resources and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So if you find your way to our No Heat page on the Boston MPO website, all of these things are available here. So there's a link to download the UTCI data. And if people are curious, I can talk more about what those downloads look like. As you can imagine, some of the data is pretty hefty, and we want to make sure people know that we are open to helping folks use the data. And if people are interested in sort of a larger scale project, we're happy to talk about working together on that. We also have our UTCI Data Explorer, which is a web map. And this provides sort of limited access to the data, but allows you to visualize it across the region in a couple different ways. And then soon we'll be releasing a story map with sort of a narrative description of the project and the data that we hope will be a helpful education tool to take a look at. And then we also want to take a second to plug the next webinar, which will be on June 9th at the same time at noon. And we'll be talking about identifying the hottest street segments in your community. So like I mentioned, we've developed some tools for folks to repeat this analysis in their own area. So, outside of the Boston region, I know folks at other RPAs in Massachusetts have expressed interest. So if that's what you're interested in, I highly recommend checking out that webinar as well. And with that, I think we can open it up for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or pop it in the chat or just go ahead and unmute yourself. Chad asks, can we talk more about how you did the walkshed analysis? Ronak, do you want to chime in on that?
Yes, happy to. Let's go back to that slide so we can look at the walk sheds. Yeah, so typically what we end up doing is we assume a maximum walking distance up to 800 meters is what we see from the literature. And then we can draw circular walk sheds with a radius of 800 meters. That's the easiest thing to do. But here, first, we started with a network walk shed because people aren't really going to fly, right? So the circular walk shed doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We want to be looking at the road network around transit stations. So that's the dark blue. That's the geometric walkshed, which uses the network and looks at the distance of each link as it's measured on the ground, right? So the geometric distance. Then we looked at replacing what would happen if we replaced the actual distance of each link with the perceived distance. So we estimated the effect of different characteristics of the network, and mostly the built environment. At that time, we had not included the UTCI. So you have without UTCI, that's light blue. Using that perceived distance showed us that the accessibility is reduced. So people will feel that they have walked up to 800 meters, even though on the ground they may have walked for less than 800 meters because the built environment is not super pleasant or conducive to walking. Then, when we include the UTCI in that measure of perceived distance on the typical summer day, so just updating what we would call the link cost or the link weight, we see a further reduction in transit accessibility. So now we are hitting 28%. And then on the hottest summer day where the UTCI is much higher, so there's a greater penalty or weight to the perceived distance. So people aren't willing to walk for as longer, then the walk shed shrinks much more, and then we see an average accessibility of 12%.
Thanks, Ronak. Um, Yeah, we've got another question here from Diane. Do you see this being equally useful in less urban areas? It's a good question. I can start, and if Rebecca or Ronak, you want to chime in, I think absolutely this is equally useful in less urban areas. Um, I think it's an interesting question to look at, what are the challenges related to heat in an urban area compared to a more rural area, maybe. But I think particularly for biking trips, people might be biking long distances, and depending on where they're able to bike, there might be more or less heat stress there. And same goes for walking, I think. Um, and yeah, if there's less well-established bike ped infrastructure, certainly, those perceived distances could be longer, and the heat risk could be even higher if you're having to go out into a large roadway or something like that. But Ronak or Rebecca, anything to add to that?
To chime in with a couple of thoughts. I do think that the framework we have established is useful for all areas, regardless of density. Compared to more urban areas, if we look at the suburbs or even more rural areas, the UTCI values on average are going to be lower. But the value of this framework is lies in helping us look at the spatial and temporal variation, right? So even within a rural community, certain locations are going to be hotter than others, and it would be useful for planners to identify those locations. As for the lack of infrastructure or the poor quality of infrastructure, that gets us into a slightly different realm where we have to think about walking by necessity and not necessarily by choice. So in rural communities, certain walks may be made out of necessity, and the lengths of those walking trips might be longer. So when we do this kind of accessibility analysis, we might want to rethink that threshold value that we use. So instead of 800 meters, it could be up to a mile, and that would be informed by any travel related data sets we might have for that community.
Great, thanks, Ronak. Um, Got another question here from Hilda, asking about using the index in developing countries. Absolutely, yeah. This, like Ronak said, the framework is applicable in all sorts of locations. I think, the challenge could be making sure you have the input data that you need. And to answer your question, yes, we'd be happy to discuss this further. And like I said, I think our second webinar could be helpful in thinking through what you might need to do that. And then Chad asks about operationalizing for targeting specific interventions. Um, that is a good question. I don't know if any others have thoughts about that. I can try to, yeah, go ahead, Ronak.
Yeah, that is exactly what we're doing, Chad. So we did not cover that in this webinar, but there are other resources that are on the website, and we are happy to share more afterwards if you'd like. So that's that. These data sets have informed the identification of those high risk locations, as we showed for Chelsea, Revere, Everett, and Framingham as well. And then we worked with our CBO partners and municipal partners to go out and do walk bike audits along these corridors to ground truth and validate the UTCI data. Um, and then we have currently four shelters as pilot interventions, which we are evaluating, and hopefully we'll be able to expand to other locations and bring in different kinds of interventions, such as cool corridors or thinking about cool pavement as well. One of the reasons why we wanted to embark on this project and develop this data set was we see that in planning, as you were saying, thinking about operationalization, that tends to happen with the use of land surface temperature. And we don't think, and this has been backed by several studies as well, that is an appropriate measure of perceived thermal comfort. So we want all of us in the planning community at large to move away from using land surface temperature to UTCI or other measures of perceived thermal comfort when we think about human-centric applications and interventions.
Thank you, Ronak. Another question from Robert. It looks like the streets typically have three lines. I assume you're looking at our Data Explorer application. And yes, those represent two sidewalks and the roadway. When Robert asked, why is the roadway being shown? I think, I mean, from my perspective, I think a lot of bicycling happens on the roadway. And so I think it's valuable to see that information too. But I think that also is perhaps a relic of the fact that the walking and biking data that we talked about from Replica comes on sort of in that format with separate values for the sidewalks and the roadway. Is that right, Ronak? Is that your understanding?
Yeah, so we are using the OpenStreetMap network. We didn't want to develop separate networks, and we didn't even have the time to do that within this project. That's something else that we are working on separately. But the network can be thought of as interchangeable. So if we go back to the slide set where you had the raster and then the link level data side by side. Yes. So on the left, this is a raster. This is a 1 meter raster. This is the output of the model. If instead of using the OSM network, OSM stands for OpenStreetMap, if we had a network representing only sidewalks or only bike lanes, we would be able to use that and then get similar link level estimates for those networks as well. Because this is a simple spatial operation to move from that raster on the left to the link level UTCI dataset on the right.
All right. Any other questions? We got plenty of time. Feel free to throw them in the chat. Raise your hand. Chad asks, are the data normalized to the region or is the scale consistent across all municipalities? The data set that is on the website available for download and the one that is visible in the Data Explorer is normalized to the region. Or no, it is not normalized to the region. It's consistent. So the values are the same no matter which municipality you're in. We did for our selecting our priority locations in our partner municipalities. We did look at the municipality specific scale. So we looked at like the top uh, highest risk segments in those municipalities. We looked at the highest risk segments, combining the UTCI and the walking and biking volume across the whole region. And as you might have guessed, that was just a big clump around Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville. Not particularly useful for comparison. So looking at the municipal level is definitely important. And I think we've discussed putting out, and we're happy to work with municipalities or others to do this, but putting out sort of somewhat custom data sets with a limited area, and scaling the data as necessary. Carmen, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and you may have already mentioned Seth, but just mentioning this data is from 2023 and that we do have plans to update it in the future, but wouldn't necessarily be every year. And so I think Chad's question, I guess maybe one, not, I don't know if it's a point of caution for the intervention, but just from the data, if you went out today and you planted a tree, um, that the effect of that tree wouldn't be captured in this data set, it would be captured in a subsequent update, a few years from now.
Yes, that's a good reminder. Thanks for that. Maybe to that point, Ronak, you could just talk a little bit about the what you all have been working on to model some of these potential interventions, to sort of look into that.
Yes. So we have been looking at the four pilot locations where we have shelters and some tree plantings and using the model to get an estimate of the cooling effects of these interventions, right? So we are looking at a couple of different scenarios. One, of course, the baseline without these interventions, and then with these interventions, and then hypothetical scenarios where we are planting more trees than are currently there on the ground as of today, right? So just to see if that really gives us a big bang for our buck, so to speak. We're doing this only for the four locations for this project, but hoping to expand on that work and try to create a scenario analysis tool that'll help us look at all of these different kinds of interventions at different locations. Because at the end of the day, the model is something that we've developed, and it's something it can stay in the background. But if we have this sort of interactive platform where you can, let's say, drag and drop different interventions, you can put in a cool corridor on a street of your liking, and you get to see within a reasonable amount of time, let's say 5 minutes or so, what the cooling effects are going to be. So that I think would be a very valuable tool for planners and community members to play around with. That is outside the scope of this project as we've committed to it, but that's something we are interested in developing further.
Thanks, Ronak. And yeah, one thing I've been thinking about too is sort of the opposite of looking at if you remove some existing trees or other structures that provide shade, looking at the difference in the UTCI. I think that can be a useful demonstration and sort of communication tool. All right, any other questions? Chad says we are doing something similar with our climate action plan metrics in Boston. That's awesome. Yeah, if yeah, folks should please feel free to reach out to us. I believe there's emails on the website page. We would love to talk more about the projects that you're working on, and any ideas that you have for using this data. Great. All right. Thank you. Gia has shared the links again to the website page, and the registration for the webinar on June 9th. Yeah, I hope to see you all there, if that is relevant to you. And yeah, unless there are any other comments or questions, I think we can wrap it up. Ronak or Rebecca, do you have anything else to add?
Nothing on my end.
No, just thanks everyone for attending. We look forward to further conversation. Please do reach out to us if you have further questions or want to explore the data a bit more with us. We have a number of people that can help talk through that. So you can find our contact information on our website.
All right. Thank you, everyone, so much. Hope to see you at the next one, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.